As we celebrate our 100th anniversary, we honor 9 great friends of BB Camp who helped make camp what it is today. Please welcome Jennifer and Moses Felberg, 3rd and 4th generation campers, to introduce our honorees.
In 1921, Julius Swett, our first Hall of Fame honoree, was the executive secretary of the newly established Jewish Federation, with an office in the B'nai B'rith Lodge. Julia convened a camp committee which established Camp Wallula in the Columbia River Gorge. In 1925, we moved to Neskowin and became B'nai B'rith Camp.
Mrs. Swett went to my grandmother and asked if my then 7-year-old dad and his 2 older brothers could join that first encampment. She told my grandmother it would cost $5 per kid, but they could take a whole year and make monthly payments so the boys could go. That started my dad's lifetime commitment to BB Camp, which has now led to 4 generations of our family attending BB Camp. Each year when my dad made his contribution to camp, he always pointed out that he doesn't think he's made up for all the payments he needed to pay for those years he went to camp.
Still today, no child is turned away due to lack of funds, and our inclusion program assures that campers of all abilities succeed at camp.
In 1928, future governor of Oregon, Julius L Meyer, the son of the Meyer and Frank founder, arranged the donation of BB Camp's property. He and his siblings, Abe Meyer and Franny Frank, donated an 11-acre piece of land overlooking Devil's Lake in memory of their mother, Jeanette Meyer.
Alex Miller headed a fundraising committee to build the entire camp. 16 cabins, the dining hall, a rec building, and an infirmary in a matter of months. BB Camp is guided by 7 midot, or values. The first is shalom, or peace, which for us means providing a sacred space for our campers. We thank Julius Meier for our magical campus, where we bring more shalom into the world.
Born in London, Millicent Mickey Hirschberg came to Portland in 1924 to teach swimming at the J. She developed a renowned hydrotherapy program that helped thousands to recover from polio. Beginning in 1932, she became the director for the B'nai B'rith Girls Camp.
Like my dad, I learned to swim with Mickey at the J, as did generations of Jewish kids in Portland. Jeannie Newmark, one of our oldest alumna, told the story of how when she was a camper a few years ago, Mickey was the camp director and rowed in the boat while Jeannie swam across the lake.
Mickey's decades of enthusiastic work won her many accolades, including the Millicent Hershberg Day at the JCC in 1948.
Our next honoree, Harry Polly Polikar, holds the record as camp director for 33 years, from the 1930s to 1971. In a letter honoring Polly for his service, Harry Glickman wrote, "Every kid who has ever played for Polly, participated in his athletic program, or served as a camp counselor knows the tremendous impact he has had on literally thousands of youngsters."
One of the supporters of the event shared a story in a letter to Glickman. It was the day of the Across the Lake boat race, and my team needed a coxswain. Polly suggested a camper named Johnny, who I thought was frail and not so sure of himself. Yet as we stood on the dock watching the boats, I saw Polly's sense of character turn into flesh. Johnny was not a frail, retreating kid. We saw a determined guy in command as they crossed the finish line first. Not only did Johnny grow that day, his team grew, as did the entire camp when Johnny was named Honor Camper. And I grew as a counselor.
Glickman's reply stated, "You will be pleased to know that the banquet for Polly last night was a tremendous success, and he was quite taken with his gift, a new Chevrolet Impala. Michelle may be getting some ideas for her 25th anniversary next year."
Our next midot is kahila, or community. Mickey and Polly built community at BB Camp for generations of campers, and our kahila is built on their foundation.
Eugene Jean Nudelman Sr. was on the men's camp board for 50 years and served as treasurer. Jean also led the camp committee at the MJCC for 18 years, guiding BB Camp's growth.
Uncle Gene's birthday always fell during men's camp. For 50 years or longer, he celebrated his birthday with his B'nai B'rith Camp men's camp family.
Gene Nudelman, he was probably our first camp historian. He was always walking around camp with a very nice camera around his neck, and he took pictures of everyone. And it didn't matter if you were a counselor, a guest, someone in the background, just someone off the lake that came and visited. If he found out your name, he would send you a copy of that photo.
When I was a kids camper in the early 50s, another of tonight's honorees, Harry Polikar, was the camp director, and Gene Nudelman was the president of the kids camp. Polly was camp director, but his wife, Mrs. Polly, was really in charge. She knew everything. She had eyes in the back of her head. Uncle Gene, you have always been a Hall of Famer in my life.
Tikkun Olam, or Healing the World, is the next of BB Camp's midot. BB campers learn to care for others and go out into the world and do good, just as Gene did for camp for many decades.
Milton Margulis was men's camp president for 25 years, from 1947 to 1971, setting the tone for what it means to be dedicated to BB campers.
So he became the president of men's camp. He saw and he had a vision for camp. He was a leader who transcended leaders. Camp became more of a fundraising arm under the leadership of my grandfather.
Milton's daughter, Sue Friedman, was a camper in the 1930s and worked with Polly and Mickey as a counselor and as a program director in the 1940s.
So I was so proud that my grandfather was the pioneer of men's camp presidents. He set the blueprint. He set the tone. He inspired people to give and give generously because that's what he did. My grandfather was egoless. He didn't want credit. He just wanted to do the right thing. He wanted to make B'nai B'rith Camp the most inspirational, the most beautiful Jewish summer camp in the entire country.
Milton Margulis' legacy was that he mentored the future leaders of camp, and we'll come back to some of those leaders later. Simcha, or joy, is another BB Camp value. We bring joy to over 1,000 campers every summer. Speaking of joy, Mike Gotesman was the camp director for 2 summers in 1977 and 1978.
My favorite memory of Mike Gotesman as camp director was his morning flag routine. We would all gather around the flagpole as the theme song to the movie Rocky would play very loudly over the loudspeaker in the dining hall. Mike would jog from the lake to flagpole in his gray Rocky sweatshirt that we staff gifted him. It was such a joyful way to start the day. Probably not for the neighbors, but we loved it, and we loved Mike. Rocky.
As a social worker focused on child development, Mike brought care for our community as the camp director and for years after in his private practice.
We're honoring Mike today, not just for the time he spent as a director of BB Camp, but for the years thereafter he spent as a mentor to literally generations of campers, staff, and lay leaders. Mike was an inspiration to all of us that knew Mike, and we're all proud to be able to continue the legacy of Jewish thought, Jewish caring that Mike brought to everything he did.
Harry Nemer was a board member for life who concentrated on 2 things: getting things donated and making men's camp great.
My father every year in July would start getting out his matching outfits for camp. He was on the executive board and they had amazing jumpsuits jackets, I think maybe even bathing suits. And they would all go down to camp wearing these matching clothes. He couldn't wait to get to camp. And then when he got home from camp, he was counting down the days until the next year that he could go and be a kid again.
When Irv and I first got on the board, Harry pulled us aside and gave us the one word of advice that we had to live with. And it was quite simple, but elegant in its simplicity. He said, schnorr everything. Anything you can schnorr, we will make sure it works for BB Camp. But if you ever cannot schnorr something, then don't worry, you can always buy wholesale.
My father, Harry Nemer, would be so thrilled to know that his great-grandchildren are enjoying BB Camp just like his children and grandchildren did.
This is a good time to mention our BB Camp value of omets lev, or courage. At camp, this means having the courage to go on the zip line, or to work through a conflict. There is no doubt that Harry Niemer had the courage to ask anyone for anything.
Remember Milton Margulis, who served as men's camp president for 25 years? Milt Carl succeeded him as men's camp president in 1971 and served in this role for 35 years.
Next to his family and friends, nothing was more important to Milt Carl than the Portland Jewish agencies and providing support to them. But of all the agencies, B'nai B'rith Summer Camp was truly his baby.
My dad would say that people would see him coming and cross the street because they were worried that he would be soliciting them. And he was the kind of guy that you couldn't say no to. So it used to be a joke that if you see him coming, go the other way.
Milt was a gentle, intelligent, and caring individual. He was very empathetic. And those qualities, coupled with his ability to support agencies, made him an elite fundraiser.
Milt, who was often budget-driven, always made certain funds were available for camperships, despite overextending our budget. He never failed in his pursuit for additional scholarship money, often bringing tears to his eyes and to the eyes of the people he was talking to. Visionaries are not always around for the realization of their dreams, but I know Milt is celebrating with us tonight. L'chaim.
In the last few years of his life, he continued to go to camp, and when he realized he wasn't strong enough anymore, it was very, very difficult for him to say, I can't go back. In 2017, August, he was really bad and camp was going to start. I knew that he would not pass before camp was completed because he wouldn't want the men to be interrupted at camp. The day camp was over, Rabbi Zuckerman came over and he told him how successful the campaign had been, and the next day my dad passed.
Door Lador is the value of passing down traditions and responsibility from generation to generation.
My grandfather saw in Milt Carl the next generation of leaders. So he took Milt Carl under his wings, and he taught Milt how to become the men's camp president. He gave the reins to Milt Carl, and Milt Carl took it to another level. And then after Milt Carl for 35 years, he taught Irv and Kyle the ins and outs of men's camp. And what Milt Carl gave to Irv and Kyle at this height, Irv and Kyle took it into the next level that we are seeing now, which is the most phenomenal camp in the entire country.
When I first started thinking about this stuff, I was starting to cry because this is something that Milt and Milt Margolis, they never would have dreamed we could have done the things that we have done with camp, how it has grown. It has gone from this small little camp hidden away in the Northwest to one of the most important and influential camps in the nation.
Really honored to have worked for BB Camp for over 20 years, starting with the late, great Mike Gotesman, and along the way with camp directors and assistant directors Stu Kronig, Robin Spring, Jen Axman, Doug Blauer, and the current great Michelle Copeland.
The last BB Camp Midot is Jave Root. Jave Root means friendships. Building meaningful relationships and friendships is what the experience at BB Camp creates for our community. Today, we are honored to induct these 9 BB Camp friends into our BB Camp Hall of Fame. We thank you, our friends, for your support as we continue to build friendships for life for another 100 years.